Welcome, bienvenue à tous. We trust that you will indeed find this morning a fascinating one as we all reflect on the international trade turmoil and tumult that we are experiencing. And so we're absolutely delighted to have with us Mr. Jesse van der Merwe, who's traveled a distance, flew here to be with us this morning. And as probably those of you who know us to some extent, you realize that what we do is based on your expressed interests, your desires. And in fact, that is why Jesse is with us this morning, because we had several ambassadors who heard him speak last year at about this very time. And they said, we must bring him to Ottawa. But I'm not going to say any more. At this point in time, I would like to ask or invite Ambassador Carlos Morales, Ambassador of Colombia, to come and just give an official sort of greeting welcome to Jesse.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. For me, this is a privilege to be here in this session with Jesse. Certainly, we are in turbulent times, very challenging for all of us, since trade agreements that were considered a rock-solid tools are now under scrutiny, public scrutiny. Markets are swinging, public policies are shifting overnight. And in general, uncertainty is the common background, not only for public policies, but also for private companies, institutions, and for normal citizens, the uncertainty. That's why last year we had the privilege to be part of the group of ambassadors invited by Christian Embassy to travel to Toronto with my colleague, my dear Ambassador Shabbat from Jordan. And we proposed, because we have, of course, the chance to hear your explanation about the economic environment. And so we proposed, Darlene, we must have Jesse in Ottawa to share his insightful views, especially in these times. That's why this is the reason we are here today, and we appreciate very much. I recognize Jesse as outstanding person, not only for his professional skills, but also for his practices in the Rockland investment in Toronto. And be, of course, this session very, very insightful for all of us. And thank you very much for coming here, Jesse, and all of you for being also in this session.
We are grateful, very, very grateful to you, Excellency, for your words of commendation, your encouragement for this to happen. We will have the opportunity to hear from Her Excellency Saba Al-Rafi, Ambassador of Jordan. She will be giving thanks after Jesse has concluded. Some of you may know who we are as Christian Embassy, others not. So again, I'll just give you a very brief sense of that. We are an NGO that has existed here in Ottawa for over 40 years now. We're associated with some others. Those others would be around the world, I guess, North America, Europe primarily, but in some other places. In fact, it's 50 years since the first one started in Washington, so we will travel there tomorrow to celebrate with them. But what is it that we do here in Ottawa specifically? We want to be encouraging diplomatic, political, and business leaders, helping facilitate networking, to be inspiring you, and including inspiring and investing in the three, what we consider very important spheres of life: professional, personal, and spiritual. And so you'll get a little taste of that today as you're here with us. And we are motivated by God's love, believing that he sent his son Jesus, that each of us would know and experience life with him. But with that all being said, I would like to introduce to you our moderator, who's a good friend. And in fact, they work together. So Jonathan Wellham, who has spoken for us frequently, some of you may have heard him. He started his own investment company in 2009 and continues to give leadership to a growing dynamic team. That's one of the many things that he does. He reflects deeply on the issues, whether economic or otherwise. Welcome with me, Jonathan Wellham.
Thank you very much, Darlene. It is a privilege to always come to Ottawa and speak on behalf of the Christian Embassy. We appreciate so much the work that they do. But right now, I get the opportunity to introduce you to Jesse. And I've known Jesse literally all his life. I mean, I knew his parents. I've known his parents even before they were married. And so I appreciate Jesse. And early on, he expressed a lot of interest in the investment business. And I didn't really take it too seriously. His father kept saying, he wants to work with you. And I thought, well, that's interesting. And so back in April of 2016, one of my employees decided he was going to move to New Zealand and he was leaving. And so it freed up an investment position in my company. And Jesse was just graduating at the exact time with his Bachelor of Commerce from McMaster University in Hamilton. And so I phoned up Jesse. I said, are you interested? He said, absolutely. And almost 10 years later, here we are with Jesse, who has worked with me. He is an exceptional individual, hardworking, very smart. He quickly earned his CFA, his Chartered Financial Analyst, as soon as he started with us. And he's been a very important part of our company. I'm fortunate to have another 5 Jessies working with me at the office. I got a lot of young men and a young woman also, but a lot of young men that are just committed to Christ, strong Christians, and love the investment business. They're always tracking gold. Gold's up again this morning, if just in case you're checking. But at any rate, so he is going to be talking about some very important topics that we talk about a lot at the business and influence our investing, and that's debt, demographics, deindustrialization, which is a big issue, and declining freedom, which is a very much of a concern around the world as we see freedom slipping away, especially within our traditional Western countries, and then also deglobalization and its impact on trade. Now, Jesse is a young man, so I wanted just to read, just before he comes up here, I wanted to read three verses from Psalm 119. And you'll know why I'm reading these once I finish reading these. Just in Psalm 119, verse 44 down to 47, it says, I will keep your law continually forever and ever. I shall walk in a wide place. Gives you freedom when you walk in the law of God. For I have sought your precepts. I will also speak of your testimonies before kings. Now, Jesse's not speaking to kings. He's speaking to diplomats, though, and shall be not put to shame. For I find delight in your commandments, which I love. And so when you come with the scriptures and the scriptural principles, and you apply them to all of life, even though Jesse is a young man, he's got some great experience already, he's coming with biblical truth. And when you come with truth, you will speak to kings and princes and important people because they want to hear the truth. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jesse and the presentation.
Thank you for that very kind introduction, Jonathan. Good morning to Your Excellencies, diplomats, government representatives, business leaders. It is a pleasure to be with you this morning. I would like to say a quick thank you to Monica again for the use of their offices here this morning. We appreciate both the policy and thought work that Cardis does at the intersections of faith, culture, and politics. I first had the privilege to meet His Excellency Carlos Morales Lopez from the Republic of Colombia and Her Excellency Sabah Rashid Al Rafi from the Kingdom of Jordan last year while on a business ambassador business tour. Their questions were insightful, their knowledge extensive, and they kept me on my toes with their questions. And they are the impetus in having me come back here again today, so thank you for that. And of course, this event would not be possible without Darlene and the whole team at the Christian Embassy. We certainly appreciate the work you do in terms of forming connections with the diplomat community, and again, for the faith that you present so clearly. I trust the topics we cover and the conversations we have today are helpful and instructive, not only regarding trade, but on other matters of policy and society. So we have a lot of material, so we'll dive right in. My goal is to get each of you to think about how thoughtful trade policy applies uniquely to your country. There's over 30 represented here today. So the goal is self-application, if you will. So before giving an outline, we'll first start with the major challenges that face the global economy and to contextualize where we're at. There are a variety of long-term trends that impact trade policy. And as we go through them, keep in mind that your country, your economy, you want to reduce your exposure to what I call the 4Ds. These are, again, four major challenges, certainly not the only ones facing the global economy, but four ones that come to our mind. I'll quickly touch on where we're at in terms of the current economy, in terms of inflation and growth. And then there is a Q&A session at the end. So of course, can't cover everything. So look forward to continuing the discussions there. So the first major challenge is debt. Personal and government debt burdens are at critical levels. There's a number of reasons. And again, these are not the only three reasons. There are many more. But these are three primary reasons that come to my mind when we think of why too much debt is a bad thing. Firstly, it creates inflationary dynamics. So when you print money or when you borrow heavily, the capital markets will start to lose confidence in your currency and in your country's ability to repay back your debt. And the value of the currency will go down. Of course, when the value goes down, the price of the goods go up. And inflation is typically a dynamic that you begin to start seeing. It's also tough in an inflationary environment for businesses to commit capital if they cannot predictably have a good sense of what their future cash flows will be. So it's hard to have a dynamic, healthy economy without healthy businesses. Secondly, you start to crowd out private investment. So the market will soak up all that government issuance, buy government bonds, and that sucks out productive capital that would otherwise be used for creating new businesses, for innovation, used in research and development. These are things that increase productivity in a society, and productivity is a key barometer of increasing standards of living. A third reason is that it fosters instability in your foreign exchange rate. Especially smaller countries, you can be susceptible to money outflows very quickly. And that also creates instability and unpredictability in the value of your currency. So again, three major reasons why too much debt is a bad thing. And ultimately, what's the end effect is that it lowers your economic growth potential. It lowers the standard of living of its citizens and can cause financial crises. The second major challenge we take a look at is demographics, and this is particularly the case in advanced economies. COVID explosion, we see that we were already on a bad trajectory leading up to COVID, but COVID really accelerated things. According to two economists, Carmen Reinhart and Kenneth Rogoff, they did a 2010 study. And it shows whenever a country starts reaching around 90% of debt to its GDP, it starts to lower that country's growth, economic growth potential. So you can imagine at 350% that we are at in terms of global debt to its GDP, we're massively lowering our economic growth potential. Secondly, I use the example here of the United States. The US, as we know, spends quite an extraordinary amount on their defense. It's their second largest budgetary item. Interest expense is quickly overtaking defense, and that's $1 trillion. And this is interest. So high debt levels have a very real impact on your government spending and capacity. And then, of course, reckless spending, when the government steps in fiscally, when, as we saw, especially during COVID, governments handing out cash directly to citizens, it should be no surprise whatsoever that we see inflation take off. Yes, there were other dynamics, but I would argue that fiscal stimulus has been one of the greatest contributors to inflation we've seen over the past number of years. The second major challenge, the second D, would be demographics. So we are facing a demographic time bomb, and this is particularly the case in more advanced economies. There are a number of reasons for this. Of course, post-industrial revolution, as we go from agrarian societies to more industrialized societies, people are having less children, people are living longer, and that contributes to it. Of course, you have the World War II impact. for the countries directly involved and for some other countries impacted by it. So you wipe out a large portion of a generation, and then you have a huge influx of babies being born. And now that generation, the baby boomers, are retiring. So you have a max exodus of people exiting the workforce, and you have fewer people entering the workforce. There's voluntary reasons, couples choosing not to have children. Some of them are economic. I mean, it's high cost of living here in this country and many countries, and so it's tough to live on a single income. And so you have economic reasons why couples are choosing not to have children. There's also climate reasons. I personally know some people, unfortunately, they're choosing not to have children because they think, by 2050, climate change will make life on Earth intolerable, or it's just too chaotic. The world is too chaotic and too dark a place to bring up children. And this is a highly unfortunate situation. You also see the attack on the biblical model for marriage, which is one man, one woman, and the subsequent moral decay. I just heard in the past week, if you can believe it, there's a couple, or I guess, a throuple in Quebec, 3 men that are adopting a child. Whether it's any portion of the whole LGBT, whatever, you can certainly expect lower fertility. And as soon as you abandon God's model for marriage, you will see your fertility rates plummet. The implications are massive, economically speaking, morally speaking, in terms of society. But in terms of economics, first, lower consumer spending and GDP. So who is going to buy your products and services? Secondly, you have shortage of labor. Who is going to work? Automation and innovation can only offset so much. And then debt and obligations. Who is going to pay? We just saw that chart again. Of course, certain countries are better off than others, but in terms of explicit debt obligations, but also unfunded liabilities, future promises for retirees. I just saw Germany in the past couple of days, they're trying to increase their retirement age to 73. So there's all sorts of implications for having poor demographics. We'll take a case example of looking at Japan, which unfortunately their country is in a bit of a death spiral when it comes to its demographics. In the mid to late 2000s, you start seeing deaths outpace births. And so what does this effect demographically have economically speaking? And we see that in terms of its economy. So at the end of the late 80s, there was a massive credit bubble in Japan. Remember our first D, debt. And when you combine both debt and demographic issues, you have massive problems for the economy. Their economy has gone essentially nowhere for the past number of decades. And that, of course, is especially stark when you overlay what the US GDP has done over that same time period, which has grown pretty rapidly, and Japan has flatlined. And the thing is, these problems are really hard to reverse. Unfortunately, the Chinese population, we just saw the peak in terms of the Chinese population. China as well, in some of the official statistics, they don't cover everything. There's a lot of local government debt. They do a lot of infrastructure spending that's allocated at the local government debt, and that's not being captured in some of the statistics in terms of their country's debt. So unfortunately, China is likely to go the same way as Japan. The population has peaked. They had the disastrous one-child policy, which now you see them massively trying to reverse there as well. And then they have debt levels, which when you kind of look underneath the surface are at really critical levels as well. The third D challenge facing the global economy is deindustrialization. So in pursuit of green energy, certain countries are seeing a deindustrialization of their economies, and which ultimately lowers the standard of living for their citizens. Renewable energy does have an important role to play in the global energy policy mix, but you have to let the free market dictate the speed. When you have a non-optimal energy policy, you open your economy up to massive vulnerability. As finance professionals, what we do is we create portfolios for our clients. We invest on their behalf. So when we look at certain countries around the world, certain economic investment opportunities, what we do is we invest in countries that, yes, they take care of the environment. We're God's stewards. This is his planet. We need to take care of the environment, but we need to develop and have a sensible energy policy and allow the free market to the greatest extent. Of course, there's going to be government bounds. There's going to be laws and rules and regulations, which are good. But in general, it's going to be a lighter touch. And by and large, you're going to allow the free market to dictate the energy mix. And in many jurisdictions, depending on the mode of energy, renewable energy can be very cheap. Again, this is not the case, as we clearly understand. So renewable energy is rather competitive in certain jurisdictions, so let it compete. It's better for the free market by and large to dictate the mix, because again, you open yourself up to tremendous vulnerability. And we see that, unfortunately, in the case example of Germany. So Germany, under Angela Merkel, unfortunately, and still continuing, what they did is they shut down all their nuclear power plants, which, as anyone tangentially familiar with the power needs of AI, you are going to need baseload power. And baseload power is best met by nuclear and things like natural gas. You could, if you decide to shut down, which they did, the nuclear power plants, their coal plants, and then outsource their energy dependency on Russia, who for years has certainly not been a geopolitical ally there, you open yourself up. And so we saw that in the past number of years. And unfortunately, what we're seeing is the heartland of Germany. I mean, we all think of German engineering and manufacturing, and it's being wiped out before our very eyes. Unfortunately, even this morning, I saw a headline, and German industrial output, this is technically manufacturing output, but this was industrial output. I should really have an updated chart here. It's back at levels not seen since 2005. So unfortunately, Germany has made a catastrophic mistake in terms of their energy policy mix. And then the fourth D, the fourth challenge that faces the global economy, is really declining freedom. I have a graph chart on the next page that really emphasizes the first 3 points here. Free markets allocate capital most efficiently. It's not a perfect system. You know, as long as we're on this planet, we're not going to have a perfect system, but it is the system that does it most effectively. So you really, a healthy economy will really imbibe individual freedoms: speech, movement, thought, religion. Private property, it will support private property. Contract law, have impartial courts, efficient courts. India is technically a democracy, but its court system is massively backlogged. So you need to have a functioning court system. And then there's going to be minimal government intervention. We all need rulemaking and laws and so forth to keep economic activity within bounds. But in general, it's a lighter touch approach. And then ultimately, the most productive society will be one that embodies biblical values, whether explicitly or implicitly. So it's a recognition that, for example, all humans are created in God's image, which means all life has dignity. This includes pre-birth. This includes the genocide that we see, and tying it back to demographics. Unfortunately, the genocide that we're seeing in many countries around the world in terms of abortion. I mean, it is really horrific. And then this also, not only does it apply to pre-birth, but it applies in older age as well. Unfortunately, as well, we're seeing a lack of recognition of human dignity in people's older years. So here in Canada, the 5th leading cause of death is state-assisted suicide. I mean, it has a much nicer name. It's called medical assistance in dying, which sounds a little nicer. But ultimately, what it is that the state is assisting you in your own ending of your own life. And you just see time and time again a devaluation of human life. And that also has massive implications for the economy. I mean, very quickly, my own example. Today is October the 8th. On October the 7th, 2023, I was diagnosed with cancer. I'm healthy now, thanks to God's graciousness, and frankly, a miracle, given what I was facing. But I'm a younger guy. I'm otherwise healthy. I was able to have a quick surgery date. I had 2 surgeries, especially the second one needed to be timely, and I was able to secure a date. However, that is not the case as you advance in your older years. You see, in Canada, unfortunately, our social infrastructure is basically collapsing. You've imported way too many people all at once. There's not a sensible immigration policy. We have one of the best immigration systems in the world when it comes to historically speaking. But you see the healthcare system really suffering. And so, when you're young, it works out well for you. But as you get older, you see its very real vulnerabilities. So you need a recognition that all humans are created in God's image, are worthy of dignity. That includes when you're very, very young to when you're older as well. Secondly, the most productive societies will be those that develop the Earth's resources. We're not pagans. We do not worship Mother Earth. We are stewards of God's creation, and we ought to develop it sensitively and with care and respect because we are stewards, but you need to develop the resources. We are in dominion over the earth, and we see, again, unfortunately, here in Canada, a crazy approach to our energy policy here. We have one of the greatest reserves of energy, especially out west, and we are choosing to not tap them to its full potential. Or lastly, the most productive societies is where individuals are productive, resourceful, and honest. So you take this all together, the 4th D of declining freedom. And so what does this mean? How can we see this in a graph? Why am I talking about this? Why do I think it's why it's a challenge in terms of the global economy? Well, we can take a look at post-communist Poland. The blue dotted line there is the kind of extrapolation of Poland's economic growth. It goes from 1970 and then around 1990 when the Soviet Union fell. And you just see it taking off in terms of its economic activity. And you really see human ingenuity. Humans, when they have freedom of thought, of course, that supports trade, freedom to trade relatively easily. And you really see Poland take off. And what's interesting to note that Poland now is a $1 trillion economy. And the UK is now smaller than Poland, which is incredible to think. The UK has decided to kind of imbibe some of these challenges which they should be avoiding. So, for example, they're not developing its North Sea resources. It has tremendous energy resources out in the North Sea, but it's choosing to untap them. We're starting to see a reversal of freedom in the country, freedom of thought and speech. And then it's heavily indebted. We remember a UK prime minister that was only there for 72 days. They tried to pass a budget, and the bond markets in that country just soared. It's the markets losing confidence in their ability to run their economy in a judicious way for the ability to pay back their debt. And you see that during that time, and we still see treasury yields or gilt yields in the UK and actually around the developed world, we see them relatively high. This is the capital markets telling you your debt levels are too high. And unfortunately, right now, the UK government is rather hamstrung in their capacity and ability to achieve their goals. So again, there was 4 Ds, 4 global challenges that we see. And this has very real economic implications, which of course, when it comes to trade policy, bleeds right into trade policy. So if we take a look at trade, you could almost call it the 5th D. We're seeing a general trend recently to deglobalization. I'll very quickly touch on inflation and the growth outlook. It's been an interesting year so far. But it's interesting to note, and when I talk about inflation, I'm talking specifically about the US, although this applies to a lot of other countries as well, is that we're actually seeing tariffs not contribute largely to inflation. Economists' predictions of widespread inflation due to tariffs have not occurred. Now, in certain sectors, you could see a little more of an impact than others, but I'm talking about the broad-based economy. And we're really not seeing inflation tick up. Now, this is when textbook economics meets reality. What actually happens in real life? Some of the reasons why, logically speaking, perhaps you could argue that tariffs would impact inflation, but we see in reality what consumers do. Consumers adjust their behavior. Perhaps they buy an equivalent lower priced good. You can also see companies become more creative and source lower cost inputs. Suppliers and businesses, they absorb a portion of the costs. Some of those countries absorb a portion of those costs, and then sellers find new markets. So there's a lot of, again, in a free market economy, there's a lot of actors moving independently. They're rational characters for the most part. And so these are some of the reasons why the inflation impact so far, I mean, I'm speaking today, but so far that we're not seeing it be too dramatic. In terms of the growth outlook, actually the growth outlook is holding up well globally. Again, the US, I'll quickly touch on just because it's such a huge market. The US printed above 3% for its Q2 and Q3 GDP so far this year. In terms of the global outlook, we're projected to grow at 3.2%, which is remarkable, especially what people were thinking, at the beginning of the year and specifically around Liberation Day with the Trump tariffs. But global growth is holding up very well. It's quite robust. In January 2025, the OECD was projecting 3.3%. And then their latest estimate given in September, it's 3.2%. So global growth is quite robust. And because of that robustness, the trade policy could still continue to be quite volatile. Governments might not feel the need to cut back on some of the renegotiation because growth is holding up. I mean, the markets are at all-time highs, the major market indices. So things are quite well. And because of that, the durability, it could be here to stay. And so in light of that, ultimately, a major point is that your country needs to be competitive when it comes to its economy, so it can be competitive when it comes to trade. So a world of America first can and should be a world of Canada first, a world of Ethiopia first, a world of Mongolia first, or whatever country you represent here today. Your governments are, of course, representatives of your people. I would argue that when an economy acts in its own best economic interest, this should lead to more trade and not less. It really goes back to the economic concept of comparative advantage, not competitive, but comparative advantage. And this concept really says that if your economy, if your country excels in perhaps a naturally endowed resource, you have a natural resource, or you have a certain skill, or you produce a good or service more efficiently, you should really focus on producing those resources, on those products, on those services. And if each country focuses on that, whatever those products or services or goods are, you will produce that more efficiently, more inexpensively, and it leads to greater wealth when each country trades then with each other. So by recognizing these physical and intangible resources, and by creating an economy that involves a rejection or reduction as much as possible to the 4 Ds, the 4 major challenges that we were just talking about, this will strengthen, arguably, trading relationships by strategic cooperation, understanding what each country does best, and by increased dialogue. I would also argue that you should not give over economic policy to supranational organizations or global elites. You know your country best. You know your people best. You set the policy, you develop those natural competitive advantages and engage in comparative advantage through trade. In terms of examples, I mean, some of this seems pretty obvious, but I think it's good to remind what that can look like. So, for example, an energy-rich Middle Eastern country can supply fuel to an island Caribbean nation that has a burgeoning cybersecurity sector. We have an investment in one business in a Caribbean country that has this quickly growing cybersecurity presence. Another example is that the deep financial markets of Canada and the US can provide capital to a very infrastructure-hungry African continent. By 2050, 23 of the largest 100 cities will be located in Africa. And this again goes back to our demographic talk. South America will be crucial in enabling the world to achieve its AI goals by providing critical minerals and metals needed in data centers and the power grid as our world increasingly becomes electrified and powered by AI. The US poses a bit of a unique trade reality just because of its size. The United States does have the world's largest consumer market. 2/3 of its economy is services-based, not goods-based. The US boasts the world's most liquid financial markets, and of course, it has a large land mass that is rich in natural resources. So as a global superpower, which the US obviously is, President Trump uses trade in a variety of ways, including to enhance security, to apply pressure, to fairly right some trade wrongs, and then to suck capital back into the country and then potentially also create a source of revenue for the US. So the US is the 600-pound gorilla in the room just because of their size, the dynamism of their economy, but not even the US is self-sufficient. There's not enough copper or uranium, for example, to supply their needs. And there's a lot of things that they don't have full measure of either. So countries represented here today, countries that you represent, you have such resources. You have such products or services that are desperately needed. You need to develop those resources. You need to know those competitive advantages, engage in comparative advantage, invest that capital, invest it back into your people, back into education, back into the economy, and let that compound over time. You know your country's unique comparative and competitive advantages, so you need to capitalize on them. So I would argue that acting in your own best interest economically and benefiting those around you, I mean, really the global community, are not mutually exclusive. In fact, it's when governments and countries don't act in the best interests of their people that often problems arise. So lastly, very quickly, some practical trade implications. So reduce exposure to those 4 Ds that we talked about: debt, excessive debt, poor demographics, deindustrialization through crazy energy policy, and declining freedom that we're seeing. You need to be competitive on the world markets, and the 4 Ds weigh down your economy. Secondly, you need to diversify trading relationships, supporting true free and fair trade. So a lot of governments can engage in subsidies, and we're not talking about, a little tax credit here or there. I'm talking about mass government subsidies for certain sectors, VATs, non-tariff barriers, etc. There are a lot of countries out there that, allegedly espouse their support for free trade, but is it really fair trade? So for example, I'm not sure if any of you had the opportunity to sit in some of the latest Chinese electric vehicles. They are impressive. They do rival some of the best of what Germany and North America has to offer. At the same time, the auto sector in China is subsidized to a tune of $230 billion since 2010. $230 billion. So how is that really fair trade? It does make sense, therefore, for certain countries. I mean, Europe certainly has a vested interest, but for certain countries to see that as unfair, and perhaps they erect tariffs on Chinese EVs into their own country. There's also non-tariff barriers, just like the ease of doing business. So India is a notoriously difficult place to conduct business. They have a lot of things going for them. They have a youthful population, again, back to the demographic topic, and a growing consumer market. But doing business there is incredibly difficult due to red tape. They have 29 states, each enforcing its own regulations on land acquisition, employment taxes, and environmental clearances. So businesses face a patchwork of laws that vary widely. Creates tremendous unpredictability for a business to operate. As of December 2024, there were 50 million court cases backlogged in the country's court systems. And then also the court rulings were vastly different, even though some of the facts were the same in each case. So there's tremendous unpredictability for businesses conducting in that country. And it's just as hard to close a business in India as to start one. According to their own government statistics, it takes over 4 years to close a factory in India. So there's a lot of non-tariff barriers that countries engage in. And so when we say free trade, we really do have to support true, free, and fair trade. You want to avoid vulnerability, concentrated trading arrangements, security measures. Australia, during the financial crisis, they had 1 quarter of negative growth. That was 0.1% in Q4 of 2008. 0.1%. They basically skirted through the global financial crisis pretty easily. And that's because their major trading partner was China. And China was engaging in massive fiscal stimulus, building out infrastructure, and so on. And so Australia supplied a lot of those minerals and resources to China, which worked out great for Australia. Now, at that time, during the financial crisis, Australia was doing around 18% of its trading business with China. Now it's over 40%. And China, as we talked about, faces the twin crises of debt and demographic issues. We'll see what happens in that country in the coming years. But when now Australia is tied to the hip in terms of Chinese economic outcomes, as Australia, you would probably want to start supplying new markets or diversifying their trade a little bit more. And then again, this goes for security measures. Uranium, very important for many countries' energy policies. Nuclear weapons, it makes no sense to outsource that vulnerability to a nation that you're not necessarily friendly with. Thirdly, very quickly, capitalizing on your country's unique competitive advantages. So those physical resources, like we said, develop them, steward them, invest in them. This goes for intangible resources too. Perhaps you come from a country, you say, to be frank, we don't have a lot of natural resources. There's also intangible resources to take advantage of. A youthful population. Africa has a tremendous resource in terms of its youthful population, especially when you take a look at trends to 2050, 2100 in terms of the rest of the world's population growth outcomes. Fourthly, restoring the importance of home and marriage, which is ultimately rooted in the biblical moral code. I encourage everyone for their countries to reject the consensus, reject a culture of death that we're particularly seeing in Western countries. Again, we think of abortion and, again, assisted dying, state suicide for the older generation as well. You just see a pervasive culture of death, and this is not deleterious only morally speaking as making up the fabric of society, but again, like we saw, it's deleterious to the economic outcomes as well. The nuclear family is the most powerful economic unit to exist. It provides stability, it provides predictability, and an environment to grow and learn. And then lastly, a society firmly rooted in ethics and morality will typically result in a healthier, dynamic economy, a more competitive economy. And again, you need to take advantage of those, whatever competitive advantages that your country has, whatever competitive advantages your economy has, you need to capitalize on that so it puts you in a better position in terms of trade policy. So that wraps up my formal remarks. So I'll ask Jonathan to come up and we can continue the conversation.
Let me kick it off. Thank you very much, Jesse, for those insightful presentation and comments. I'm intrigued again with the debt crisis, and we're in the investment business. We talk about this a lot. That was your first D. And the growth in debt throughout the world is really quite shocking. It's really gone exponential in the last couple of years. Because of that debt, what are some of the implications, say, for some of the currencies around the world and the pressure that we are probably going to see? Similar, even back in the 70s, we saw some erosion of currency values. Again, when you look at that, what do you think in terms of, this is for the US dollar, which is the reserve currency of the world, and the impact that will have then on trading and so on?
So when it comes to currencies, I mean, in one sense, it's all relative, but we see the erosion and the debasement of currencies, including the US dollar, which may be stronger than others. But you see a debasement in the value of that currency. So, for example, as even we mentioned briefly this morning, you see, for example, the price of precious metals. You see a world that is losing confidence in a financial system and also losing confidence in its currencies. And you see the values of those assets go up. As capital allocators, what we're interested in is hedging ourselves against the debasement of these currencies. I mean, ultimately, all currencies around the world are fiat currencies. They're not tied to the real value. Historically, they've been tied to the real value of gold, but they're not really tied to the real value of anything. So as the debt levels go up, countries are going to have no choice but to debase their currencies because they can't pay back all the debt that they're owed, including the unfunded liabilities that are owed as well. So what you want to do is really protect yourself. You want to own real assets. You want to own, whether that's real estate, financial assets, stocks, ownership interests in businesses, precious metals, and so on. You want to protect yourself because this debasement, I mean, in my opinion, is just going to accelerate because of those debt levels that are essentially unsustainable for, again, a lot of the advanced economies around the world.
I think one of the, Jesse did mention the unfunded liabilities, but if you look at the United States, again, we pick on the US simply because that is the reserve currency, is the most powerful economy in the world. Their unfunded liabilities, according to their own government statistics, and that would be the obligations, the present value of all the obligations that they owe, is over $120 trillion, okay? That's on an economy that's about 30 trillion and on a budget revenue at the federal level of about 5.5 trillion. So you can see that these are huge issues. Europe also has a severe pension problem. That's probably why Germany is asking its citizens to work an extra 5 or 6 years. There's no way that people can retire at these ages. And we see in France has just had its third government in 12 months, and it's really on the brink of collapse also. So again, these things are really coming to a head. And I think, as Jesse has pointed out, for countries that are smaller around the world, second world countries and not as advanced, being positioned strongly and competitively and having your own finances in order will be really important going forward, I think, in terms of that, because these issues again, are intractable. They're not going to go away. There's no quick solution in terms of some of these big, large Western countries. And again, it gets back to what Jesse had pointed out, maybe again, just fill in some of the spiritual element of it, that as countries come increasingly detached from faith and from values and virtues, their economies become weaker and weaker and more vulnerable. And so that's what we're seeing also. Maybe just comment a little bit tied into that declining freedom, declining virtue, that spills over in a massive way to the economy.
I mean, as society moves away from absolute truth, and of course we see truth as only rooted in God himself, who is immutable. He is truth itself. We see over the past number of decades, society move away from truth. Everything becomes relative. There is no absolute truth. It's just what you and I feel or that person feels. And you see the effect on society. It goes from kind of socially in terms of crime and punishment. And this has a huge implication for the economy. As society moves further and further away, the amount of economic activity that is lost to just the debasement of morals within this society is huge. You see that economically speaking. I mean, ultimately, fiat money is not tied to anything real. There's no accountability there. And without a proper view of who man is, which is inherently, unfortunately, sinful, there has to be accountability and understanding that the global financial system in some ways has no accountability. It helps you when you approach how to manage your economy as best as you can, how to allocate capital as best as you can. Yeah, it's impossible to separate the moral from the economic.
I'm speaking at lunch to a different group about the growing technology and the impact of technology. And I think, again, when it comes back to trade in countries around the world, the U.S. Currently right now is sucking or bringing in a lot of capital, a lot of money's flowing into the U.S. As I think you probably know. I think Trump has suggested it's up to almost $20 trillion that's being committed into the country. These are large amounts of capital. And what that's going to do, if they can continue this trend for a couple of terms, another 10, 12 years, the U.S. is going to be incredibly powerful and strong as an economy, despite their debt problems, and because it is somewhat relative. And so that's going to be a big issue, I think, for other countries to compete with the U.S. 20 years ago, the U.S. was the same size as the EU. Now it's 50% larger. And so you're seeing, again, tremendous shifts going on. And this is one of the reasons why Trump, who is a business person, is really running the U.S. As a business person and attracting that capital. And wherever you can get capital into your country, it is going to rock and roll in a major way. And so I think that, again, for other countries, they need to be watching what the U.S. is doing. Lowering regulation, lowering taxes, bringing capital into your country is a winning recipe for economic growth. Whether you like Donald Trump or not is another issue. And so it's going to make the world much more competitive. We in Canada are having our lunch eaten by the United States currently. And capital is going to continue to flow from Canada to the U.S. where it's going to be treated more favorably. So you're going to see that in your countries also. But that's an opportunity to shape up, be competitive, as Jesse has pointed out, because I think that is causing a lot of these bureaucracies to break down. And if you're just running a bloated bureaucracy and inefficiency, it's going to be difficult going forward. I think in the world of technology and AI and digitization and robotics, and EVs and all of these things that are coming down the pipe. You have a lot of these resources, a lot of the resources that are going to be necessary to feed this massive increase in energy, which is coming. You're talking global energy growth of 15 to 20% just in the next 10, 15 years. You've got the resources, the copper, the nickel, the lithium, the cobalt, et cetera, all of these resources. And so use that to your advantage. That will give you a great opportunity then to invest back in manufacturing and some of your other sectors.
That can't be understated there. I think the statistic I read, we're taking a look at global growth, which is holding up well. The US is holding up well. Half of that economic growth in the US, they say, is around close to 50% in some way tied to that AI capacity build out. Data centers, electrification of our grid, which is sorely underinvested. And so often when we think of AI and digitization, we think of it, in the cloud. It's almost intangible. The processes to enable all that is extremely tangible, and that's what's not appreciated by the markets, and actually influence what we do at Rocklink in terms of allocating capital, because we think the case for the physical resources that go into all these processes is not fully realized. We're starting to slowly get a sense of the energy needs and resource needs, but that's certainly an area that, again, the US is big, but it's not self-sufficient. It does offer an opportunity for many countries to take advantage, especially trying to reverse some of the challenges that we saw and take advantage of other countries' mistakes. So that's certainly something to think about.
In our nation, we have had to improve our economy in terms of debt to GDP, as we had more than 150% debt. In poor economies, you have to borrow in order to develop your resources. Is debt necessarily always bad, especially if it is for the purpose of building up your economy?
Very good question. So to the first point about government debt, not all government debt is bad. So for example, in the 50s, the US borrowed to build out its interstate highway system. And that was a productive use of debt. So governments should borrow and can borrow when it's going to funnel that capital into productive assets. That's a good use of debt.
One of the problems facing small economies that we need to address is corruption. Can you comment on this?
And certainly corruption, I mean, not only in other countries, but we see it, I mean, unfortunately, in some very advanced economies. So certainly corruption is a pernicious, perhaps, aspect in other countries, but it exists everywhere.
I like the idea of freedom that you mentioned. However, if you allow every individual to do as they like based on freedom, what happens to our society? For example, the lack of housing and poverty levels, which are alarmingly high in the last few years.
In terms of freedom, I mean, we're talking about freedom that obviously occurs within ethical and honest boundaries. There has to be a functional government that sets rules and regulations and laws that regulate human freedom, so to speak. It's not freedom to do this is not absolute freedom to do whatever you want. Again, going back to absolute truth, just because I have, quote, freedom doesn't mean I can do whatever I want. And that gets more into a philosophical topic as well. There was that point about individuals being accountable, honest, and ethical. We should have freedom, but we should also have court systems. We should have rules, regulations. There's some regulation on freedom, and it's not necessarily unbridled freedom.
Yeah, and just a quick point there. The freedom of society will only be maintained to the public and private virtue of the citizens. Okay, so if you look at a country like Canada, we've seen a massive spiritual decline in this country of faith. And to the extent that people are no longer accountable or responsible, they don't expect that from the government. The government then leverages that and takes advantage of it. It's top down, bottom up. And so it is that's an ongoing challenge. But I would say that freedom and transparency, it's very important also that you run transparent economy so that people can see what's happening. Increasingly in Canada, I'll pick on Canada because I'm Canadian and it's easier for me to take shots at Canada. And to be fair, we've seen a complete lack of transparency in our government over the last number of years. And then that breeds, I think, corruption. And breeds a frustration with the state. So freedom can only be held by people who are going to respect it and have the ethics and morality to support it. And that's why as Christians, I think the church and families, Jesse mentioned the family unit is the most important bulwark to support freedom and also to push back against totalitarian government. Where you have strong families, you have weak. You don't have to have overpowering governments. Where you have weak families, you have overpowering governments. And so this is very, very important in terms of understanding those arrangements. So excellent points. And that's the ongoing challenge we have. There's no dull moments in this world, right?
Your point of diversifying trade relationships is very insightful. Every country is facing Trump's tariffs. For most countries, the American market is the major export market, and it takes time to diversify. From your perspective, what is the strategy or concrete measure that you would recommend to a government? How can smaller, like-minded countries work together multilaterally to diversify their major export countries and lower the risk of such diversification?
Yeah, so as let's say you're a smaller country, what you could do is leverage, like you mentioned, multilateral trading relationships. You have more leverage if you work in a bloc. I mean, of course, the European Union is the prime example of this. They try and work in a bloc as much as possible. The US is the 800-pound gorilla in the room. It's just such a huge export market for so many countries, and it's tough to move the needle per se, maybe as one country. But this is maybe what requires a lot of fancy footwork and a lot of dialogue, because perhaps you can band together with other countries to gain some leverage that you might otherwise not have as an individual country. And I would say, again, US is big, but it's not self-sufficient. Even in terms of Trump is going to try and reshore as much as possible. He has a lot of leverage to try and do that, but it's not all possible. And there's some certain skills that US just doesn't have. We even see that with iPhone manufacturing. Now, is that going to change with increased automation, robotics? Perhaps, but there's certain things that certainly you have that other countries need. And if you band together, perhaps you can get more leverage. It's all about making your economy as competitive as possible, taking advantage of what you're best at, and then perhaps together with other countries that have some simpatico or some other skills as well, in working together to get that leverage you might not otherwise have.
Her Excellency, I'm going to ask you to come up and to finish things off here.
Thank you, Jesse. It is a great pleasure and an honor to be able to thank you on behalf of everyone here today for your presence and for your outstanding and deeply analytical presentation. I remember last year when I attended with His Excellency Carlos from Colombia, your session where we sat and we discussed, and I found that you have brought so much information and so much analysis that really needs to be exchanged and presented to a broader perspective. Today's seminar, it provided us with a lot of rich food for thought on the challenges facing global economy, on solutions that define trade in an increasingly fractured world. You have given us ideas on how to work for the benefit of our country's economy, how to be competitive, but as well, how to still work together. It reminded us that when thoughtful analysis is guided by moral awareness, it can help us navigate complexity with balance and purpose. As well, I would like to thank the Christian Embassy, our friend Darlene, and the team for creating this space for reflection. Thank you again, Jesse.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm going to end with a prayer and then turn it over to Rob just to complete the time here. So let's just look to the Lord in prayer and thank him for this time that we've had. Our Heavenly Father, we do thank you for your goodness and grace to us in Christ. We thank you for the time that we've had together. Many countries represented here all around the world. This is the world that you have made, all of these different nations and countries that you rule over. And we pray that we might be responsible citizens of the world that you've placed us in, and that we would look to you and to your laws and to your rules and to your justice. We thank you for the scriptures, which give us the guideposts and give us the rules in which we are to follow. And we pray that as countries and nations that we would work together and that we would trade together, that we would enjoy the fruits and benefits of the world that you have given us. We thank you most importantly for the Lord Jesus Christ and the salvation that we have in him. We thank you for the righteousness that we have, that we do not have in ourselves, and that we can have full forgiveness of our sins through Christ. We pray that you would be with us now. Bless us for the remainder of this day, for your honor and your glory and for our good. In Jesus' name we do pray. Amen.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. And thank you, Excellency, for those wonderful comments. So again, thank you to Mr. van der Merwe and to Jonathan for their participation in this time. And thank you for your presence with us. And have a good day.